All right, thank you so much, Melissa, for having me. Good evening, everyone. How are we doing? Yeah, that's right. So as you've already heard, I am from the States, as you can tell by my accent. I also come from Los Angeles. So I had a really, really long flight. But one of the things that I love to do is talk, which is good because my job is to be a senior consultant on the training and implementation team at Paradigm. You can learn more about what we do at Paradigm, but here's a short version. Much like Melissa was saying, we believe that it is imperative that organizations become more diverse and inclusive, and that the way to do so is by helping to raise awareness about bias and how it exists in the world, how it impacts the way that we evaluate people, the way that we engage with people on a day-to-day basis, and then help companies find ways to make structural and individual changes. So in my role, I spend a lot of time talking to people about inclusive leadership, about fostering belonging, about managing bias. But one of my most favorite things to do is not just to talk about bias, implicit, structural, and otherwise, but to go beyond that and tell people, all right, now that you get it, that bias is a thing, what are you going to do to take action? And so I'm excited to share with you all some of my musings based in research and otherwise about how we can engage in effective allyship. Before we do that, I got a story. How many of you in this room have ever had to move from one apartment to the next, maybe across countries, right? Yeah, okay, many of us. Now, how many of us enjoy packing up all those boxes, lugging them out of our house or our flat or what have you, putting them into the moving truck, and then taking them out of the moving truck, putting them into our new flat, unpacking them and all that? Who loves it? Yeah, no, it's the worst, right? So I recently had to move, and I promise this relates to allyship. So I recently had to move, and you know, it was the worst. I was tired. It's hot in Los Angeles, so the sun was beating down on my back. I was sweating like mad. And I thought to myself, where are my friends? Right? Anyone? Yeah. Where are my friends? Now, the reason that this relates to allyship is this. When it comes to moving, as we've all been there are a variety of ways that we can get help. And I'd like for you to join me in imagining how I felt 2 hours into packing those boxes and driving across LA traffic to my new apartment and starting to unload them. And you know, there are a few things that my friends could have done. The very minimum is maybe tell my other friends, hey, Evelyn's moving today. Okay, great. At least people are aware that some moving was happening. Maybe my friends could even say, hey, Evelyn's moving today. Somebody should help her. Right? Yeah, a little bit better, but still not taking much action. They could even go a step further and be like, hey, Evelyn, I see that you've been moving for a long time. You're a little sweaty, girl. Here's a glass of cold water. So I'm like, yeah, good, water. Gulp it down. Still got to get back to moving. Who is feeling happy about the help they've received yet? No, right? What my friends could also have done is to say, you know what, Evelyn? I am going to get in that moving truck with you, pick up those boxes, and help you move them into your new apartment. Feel a little bit better about that one, right? But what I would submit to you is that the best thing that one of my friends or multiple friends could have done is say, Evelyn, you've been at this for a long time, girl. You take a seat. I'm going to unpack the rest of these boxes, bring them off of the truck for you, bring them into your apartment. Here is a glass of water. Here's a cool fan. Hang out. We got this. If moving were like that, I'd probably do a lot more moving, right? Now, the reason this relates to allyship is because every single one of those steps that I just talked about, from the very minimum, hey, Evelyn's moving, all the way to my friends who could actually help me and say, I got this, you take a seat, are the various ways in which we can engage in allyship. And much like the first kind of 3 levels where people just raised awareness, made other people aware that I was moving, and said, hey, I'm going to try to alleviate this by giving you some water, but not actually do any work myself, that's doing something, but it's not doing enough. And really what we need to get to is a place where we're saying, not just how can I join you and help you in what you're doing, but how can I recognize that if you've already been at it for a long time, you need somebody to say, I got this now, you take a break. And so that's really the goal of when we think about what engaging in effective allyship is. It's saying, how can I notice the experience of others? Recognize that it's not just my role to draw attention to what they're going through. It's not just my role to make them feel more comfortable with what they're experiencing. It's not even just my role to join them in whatever they're doing. But the pinnacle of allyship is to say, it is my responsibility to help alleviate some of that burden by recognizing that part of what I can do is take my share and really let them take a break and know that I got their back. The reason that this is so important is that, as you've heard, right, one of the goals of the Honeycomb Works, and something that I personally value and that Paradigm values as well, is creating an inclusive culture. And allies have a uniquely wonderful role to play in creating an inclusive culture. Because what we know is that organizations and the people within them thrive when companies are diverse and inclusive. If you want to get people feeling like that little girl jumping into the pool, make your organization diverse and inclusive. There's a lot of research demonstrating both how, when it comes to a business's bottom line, as well as the experience of belonging and inclusion that all employees feel, that when companies get this right, you can feel it, you can see it, it's measurable. So allies can play a role in this, but the reason I'm focusing on allies here is that when you are a target of discrimination, there's a lot of things that you encounter that can really inhibit your ability to feel like you are included and valued within your organization. A lot of research that I and my colleagues have done looks at how people decide what counts as racial bias. And what we know is that if you are a member of a group that experiences discrimination, you are really attuned to all of the subtle ways in which it might appear. And that makes sense, right? Because nobody wants to walk into a situation where somebody is going to be racist toward you and then be blindsided, right? Or caught off guard is what I should say. And so as we're thinking about the various ways that bias can manifest, noticing the subtleties is really important. But what research has shown is that when it comes to how people of color, people from underrepresented minority groups, for example, ethnic minority groups, when it comes to how they notice bias, we notice the subtle things as well as the blatant things. But people from majority racial and ethnic groups, like white people, are only looking for the blatant stuff. So what that means is that if I'm noticing your body language, if I'm noticing that you're smiling at me, but it doesn't quite reach your eyes, if I'm noticing that you always try to seem like you're getting out of conversation with me really quickly, but my colleague is just looking for you to call me the N-word, we are going to have very drastically different perceptions of what inclusion feels like within our organization. And so as an ally, one of the things that's so beneficial is that if you get attuned to the way that the communities that you are seeking to support detect bias, you can help to create that inclusive culture. But not only that, we also know that if and when you don't notice and call out discrimination, you are allowing an environment that is toxic to a certain subset of people to persist. Research demonstrates time and time again that the consequences of experiencing discrimination are linked to a greater incidence of mental health outcomes like greater stress, anxiety, and depression. Physical health ailments like a greater incidence of cardiovascular disease, or my personal favorite, gastrointestinal problems. Literally experiencing bias ties you up in knots inside. But not only that, when you are walking into your workplace and you're aware that you're not going to get a smile that meets the eyes, or you're wondering whether somebody is going to try to get out of that conversation with you as quickly as possible, it's really hard to feel like you belong. When you don't feel like you belong, every single interaction that you have is a data point where you question, is this the day that I'm going to feel like I belong or not? And that question, when unresolved, takes up precious mental resources that you could otherwise be using to, do your job. And so it's not just that discrimination is a negative impact on the individual in terms of performance, but in terms of overall well-being, it matters quite a bit. And finally, You can't believe all of this, right? You're experiencing these subtle forms of discrimination. You're hurting literally and psychologically as a result. And then when you tell people about it, you know what they do? Don't be so sensitive. Oh, they didn't mean it that way. Get over it. You just need to grow a thicker skin. Who's heard that before? Yeah, almost everyone's hand went up, right? Now, here's the thing. What we know is that there is research that was just published by Dr. Keon West that shows that when people, regardless of race or ethnicity, experience subtle forms of bias, regardless of whether you are Black, white, Asian, Latinx, Native American, everybody agrees that it sucks to be on the receiving end of the subtle stuff. And yet somehow, when people of color, when members of the LGBTQIA community, when women, when people with disabilities call attention to the bias and discrimination they've experienced, people reliably are more likely to say, get over it, you're being an oversensitive complainer. And that just doesn't have an interpersonal outcome, but research by Dr. Cheryl Kaiser and colleagues has demonstrated that it has an impact on whether those people are perceived as likable, as hireable, as leadership material. So you can see how, when it comes to how we understand what needs to happen in order to create an inclusive culture, the stakes are high. Because our goal is to create that environment where everyone can thrive, but these are the barriers to doing so. So now that I've sufficiently scared you all, right? I see this is like, you're like, oh my God, this is not what I signed up for. Let me share with you some good news. The reason we're here all today is that we want to think about what we can do to make all of that stuff on that scary slide before less of a reality. And there's been a lot of conversation these days about what allyship means, what it looks like. And if you remember nothing else that I say today, I want you all to take away the point that being an ally requires action. You cannot just sit back and be like, haha, I'm an ally, I did it. No. You have to actually engage in behaviors that consistently demonstrate that you are actively engaging in efforts that are going to make things better for the communities that you strive to support. Evelyn, how do we do this? I heard those questions. I'm so glad you asked. Here is the first thing. I encourage you to create a culture of accountability. And when I say a culture of accountability, you can think of any sphere of influence. It could be your family, your friendship groups, your team at work, your company at large, the world, if you so choose, right? Get that accountability out there. Research that I did with my colleague, Dr. Margot Monteith and Dr. Mason Burns, asked people about how often they noticed times in their lives where they could have spoken up about bias that was happening, right? So they witnessed it. You ever had that experience where you see something happen and you're like, oh, that's not right? Who's been there? Yeah, that almost every hand, right? Or heads nodding. Now, here's the sad thing. In the research that we've done, guess what percentage of people actually speak up and say something in those moments? Give me some numbers. What do you think? What percentage? 12, 5, 15, 10, 7%, 3, 90. We got other, yeah, you all are really pessimistic, which I like. The number wasn't quite as low as what you were saying. It's 25%. But that's still not great, right? So it's not 3, but it's not 100% either. And so when you think about all of the things that we're noticing in the world, and that only 25% of the time are we likely to actually speak up and say something, I mean, 75% of the time we're letting a lot of stuff go. But it wasn't only that we found that people were really reluctant to speak up and hold people accountable for not saying or doing biased things. We also did a little more digging to find out, okay, in that 25%, what were people doing? How were they holding people accountable? How were they confronting bias, as I like to call it? You know what I think was the most interesting finding? When we asked people, who were the folks that you were confronting? Who were the people that you were standing up to? Only 6% of the time was it a stranger. 88% of the time, it was an acquaintance, a close friend, or a family member. So what that means is that when you think about creating a culture of accountability, you have to start with the people who are within your immediate network, your immediate sphere of influence. And for many of us, right, that also means we start with ourselves. So hold yourself accountable, hold others accountable too. And then call out bias. And you're gonna hear a lot more about this from others who will be speaking today, including the brilliant Caroline, right? But one of the things that I think it's really important to emphasize here is that one of the things that we know from research is that the biggest barrier to calling out bias, to saying something, anything, is that we tend to notice what's happening and then we sit back and we're like, oh, what do I say? How do I say it? Okay, okay, but what about my tone of voice? And did I phrase it correctly? And let me make sure I have it exactly right. And then an hour later, the moment has passed. Yes, you are like, that is me. It was also me. I can tell you a story. So my goodness, this like really got to me. So there's this show in the US, maybe over here too, called How to Get Away with Murder. Anyone? Yeah, okay. And so a few years ago, there was this, so there's lots of very intense romance scenes on the show, but a few years ago, they featured a romantic scene with two men. So it was, a scene of two men getting it on. Granted, this show had plenty of other versions of two women getting it on, man and woman, so this wasn't necessarily new in terms of the sexuality of the show. But one of my friends, we will say friends, on Facebook wrote a status and she said, I am done watching How to Get Away with Murder. They are just forwarding the gay agenda. And I was like, girl, it's like 2017. Who says gay agenda anymore? What are you doing? But you know what I did? I saw her post on Facebook. And I turned to my boyfriend at the time, and I said, that is so wrong. What a homophobic statement to make. And then I put my phone down. And I thought about it for like 10 more minutes, and I was fuming. I was like, I can't believe she would say something like that. What's wrong with her? Doesn't she realize the double standard that she has? That's what makes her stop watching the show? Okay. Said that to my fiance and then boyfriend again. Another 10 minutes went by and I was like, no, okay, Evelyn, you're doing research on how to call out bias. You're telling other people to do it. You should probably say something. And so then I got on my phone and started typing what I can only describe to be a paragraph-long dissertation on Facebook about how wrong she was to be saying everything that she said in that statement. And as I was typing, I started racing, and then I was like, hey, boyfriend, now fiance, read this. And he was like, Evelyn, why? This is a lot of stuff. 45 minutes later, I finally commented. And I'm still not confident that exactly what I said was right. But one of the things that I realized was that I didn't have ready-to-go phrases, statements that I could say in those moments to say, hey, that's not okay. And just like me, right? We all have those moments where we notice something because we haven't practiced what we would say in those moments, whether it's as simple as an eye roll and walking away, or saying, that's really not okay, it's inappropriate to use that language. If we don't have that practice, when the time comes, we're gonna be in that 75%. So being an ally is an actionable thing, but what we also know is that you gotta engage in a little risk. Because one of the things about being an ally is that when you are not a member of the communities that are being marginalized or stereotyped or held back from accessing various opportunities, that means that you have a privilege that is unearned. And while you might be able to, or while you might want to sit back and be like, oh, she's talking about privilege and now I'm going to get defensive, I challenge you to think about your privilege as a superpower. Because what research has demonstrated is that when it comes to the complainer effect, right, that people from the underrepresented groups face when they talk about their experiences with discrimination, when you're not a member of those groups, it doesn't happen to you. So men who say, yeah, that's really sexist, they don't get called a complainer to the same extent. White people who say, racist, don't get called a complainer. So it's a superpower that you can use, but I encourage you to wield your power carefully, right? Because one of the things about being an ally and recognizing that you have the ability to confront bias, to take up a little bit more space, is that you could be like, great, so now I'm just gonna go around calling out bias everywhere and speaking over people and shutting them down, and I don't care if that's what the groups I'm trying to support actually want. So one of the things you have to do is get aligned with the goals, the needs, the issues that are facing the communities that you are striving to support, and then be like, all right, I'm ready to jump in. Now, I say it takes risk because, yeah, you don't face the complainer effect to the same extent. But what it does require is that sometimes you need to take a step back to allow other people to have opportunities they might not. Here is a bad example of that. A year and a half-ish ago, this tweet went viral. It says in all caps, "All Male History Conference." This goes for the Guinness Book of the Century. A team of 30 white male historians will discuss applied history at Stanford. What a shame. This was an applied history conference that was taking place at Stanford, and nobody had realized that every single person who was speaking at the conference was a white guy. Now, here's the thing. I'm sure the conference organizers could say, yeah, Evelyn, like, wish we weren't the example in your presentation, but, you know, it was really hard finding people and, you know, we used our networks and that was who was available and we had to put this together on a tight timeline. And so this is who we got. But the problem is that even if that were the case, half of these men could have said, who else is speaking on this panel? Who else is an attendee at this conference who's going to be sharing remarks? And it could have been on one of them or 15 of them to say, oh no. Listen, I need the line on my CV as much as the next guy, but I also recognize that I have had plenty of opportunities to speak. And so instead of me, here, take my gender nonconforming colleague, take my woman colleague, take my anybody else colleague, and put them into the spotlight, give them access to those opportunities. That's the hard part of allyship. When it comes to using your privilege to help and uplift and support, people can usually get on board. But when it comes to saying, oh, I gotta use it to take a step back and put somebody else there, that's where it gets tricky. And it doesn't always go well, but there are many examples of times when it does. So this is a tweet from Octavia Spencer, and it's a really interesting story. I encourage you all to read up about it, where Octavia Spencer and Jessica Chastain were working together on a movie. I believe it was The Help. And Jessica Chastain learned that Octavia Spencer was making pennies compared to what she was making. And so Jessica Chastain said, I am going to now tie my salary to Octavia Spencer's. And whatever you pay me, you've got to pay her. And if you don't do so in a way that's equitable, I'm leaving. Now, the studio could have been like, okay, bye, right? But they didn't. And what ended up happening is because Jessica Chastain took a stand, Octavia Spencer was able to ride the kind of wave of that risk and get what she deserved. And I want to be very clear here. I'm not celebrating Jessica Chastain as the ally who has done it. But this is an example of how when you take that risk, it can sometimes pay off. And even if it didn't end up in this way where Octavia Spencer got more money and Jessica Chastain still kept the job, it would always be an indicator that we know where Jessica Chastain stands. And Octavia Spencer does as well. So with that, I want to bring it back to the story that I started with at the beginning. Thinking about all of the moving that we have done, right, and how that aligns with our desire to be allies. And I would love to hear from you all as you're thinking about questions you want to ask me or discussion afterward. Where are you on your path toward meaningful allyship? Are you like, oh, Evelyn, I'm like more of the offering water person? Or maybe you're not even there. Maybe you're just like, oh, I get it. I notice bias. It happens. Or maybe you're saying, you know what? I am in the place where I'm telling other people, you take a seat and I will lift those boxes. but I'm wondering how to do so in a way that is authentic and genuine and not patronizing. That's really and truly going to be helpful and effective. Wherever you are, I'd love to hear from you. And I want to encourage you to keep going wherever you are on your path so that we can help to create those organizations that are truly inclusive for everyone who is there. Thank you all very much. Haha.
So piping hot, so we can get away with a couple of questions, but then we'll come back and we'll have more of an opportunity to chat over food and drinks and all. So if anybody has something they want to ask, next Mary's, you myself, like you really want to ask.
No. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
You can't actually identify with the person and what they've just done, and then being able to respond in a way which is productive and, you know, as you say, it's not kind of counterproductive, but it's that sort of how do you so it's really hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's that sort of we need to be able to give people the ammunition or the armor to say that's not okay.
Yep.
Help me understand how this is okay, or how you've just kind of phrased that. And I think that's the piece that's kind of missing for me. It's like, how do we really put those kind of tangible
Yeah.
things that they can actually use to be able to say in a situation and think on their feet.
Yep.
Because I think it's the thinking on your feet
Yep.
piece, which is part of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe this has just been such an answer.
Yeah.
She's been such an answer.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
I like all of those words. Well, no, so I think what what you're getting at really is this, like, how do we do this? How do we actually make sure that we are prepared with those phrases in the moment? That is almost entirely what Caroline is going to be really digging into and what you all are going to be working on as we continue thinking about the plan of action. But I will share with you my personal favorite strategy, which is to ask questions. One of the things that we know, right, is that when it comes to stereotypes and the associations we have with different groups, that is the result of our brains working really quickly. But if you ask somebody to elaborate more on what they were saying, or my personal favorite, what makes you say that? Or, that's interesting, tell me more. Then they're not using that fast, unconscious part of their brain. They have to engage in the slow, logical, conscious processor. And so one of two things will happen. They will realize, oh, that was not a good thing that I just said. Or they will dig themselves into a deeper hole where the stereotype that is like the root of everything they said is there waiting for you and you can crush it, right? So my personal favorite example of this is I work with a lot of leaders who are thinking about how to diversify their employee base, and without fail, somebody, sometimes more than one somebody, says, okay, Evelyn, I really value increasing diversity in my company, but how do I do that without lowering the bar for getting in? Every time. And so then I say, well, what makes you think that you have to necessarily lower the bar in order to get more diversity in your organization? They say, well, because, if you've got a bunch of white people and they're qualified, and then you're finding other people of color who are you're trying to get them in so they're less qualified. And then I'm like, but what makes you assume that people of color are inherently less qualified and that white people are more qualified? And they say, well, because, and then it's brilliant watching that spiral. Yeah, so that's my personal favorite strategy, but there are plenty others. But yeah, that's the one. I know you had a question there. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, what is your industry that you're in? Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah. So confirmation bias is quite interesting, and it's related to kind of the whole umbrella of cognitive biases that impact the decisions that we make and the way that we interact with people. The short version of confirmation bias is that once we make a decision about something, like how competent a person is, we are then more likely to notice and attend to and pay attention to information that confirms what we think to be true. The other side, though, is that we ignore information that would tell us that we're wrong. And so one of the things that, again, a lot of what I do work with the clients and the leaders that I work with is to tell them, if you find yourself engaging in well, you won't find yourself engaging in confirmation bias, but if you notice that there are these various proxies that you are using for, let's say, competence, like the school a person went to, or the number of years of experience that they have, or any other kinds of traits that might suggest that they have it, whatever it might be, that what you're probably doing is relying on a more subjective process to make those decisions. And I would encourage you to add more structure to your process. Because when you sit down and you think about, let's say in the context of hiring, that it's not just that a person is competent automatically because they went to Northwestern, which is where I went to school, by the way, I'm picking on it, right? They're not automatically competent because they went to Northwestern. But what are the skills? What are the pieces of information that you might be able to actually evaluate that can give you insight into not just how the school they went to tells you that they're competent, but that you can measure from that individual based on their actual behavior that they do have that level of competence that you seek. So that's a very truncated answer. I talk about this literally all day, so we could talk more about it as we're eating, but I do want to be mindful of the fact that the food is probably now the perfect temperature for eating. So thank you all, and I'll see you over there.